Have you ever noticed that when there are 20 or 30 people talking together in a room, there are occasional moments where everybody becomes very silent, so that for a second, there's a sudden vibrating emptiness that seems to swallow up all sound? I don't know how it affects other people, but when it happens, it makes me feel cold all over. Of course, the whole thing's merely caused by the laws of probability, but somehow it seems more than a mere coinciding of conversational pauses. It's almost as if everybody is listening for something, although they don't know what. At such moments, I feel somewhat unsettled, however cheerful the company in which it happens. Yes, even if it's in the White Hart. It was like that one Wednesday evening when the place wasn't quite as crowded as usual. The silence came as unexpectedly as it always does. Then, probably in a deliberate attempt to break that unsettling feeling of suspense, Charlie Willis started whistling the latest hit tune. I don't even remember what it was. I only remember that it triggered off one of Harry Purvis's most disturbing stories.
Charlie, that song is driving me mad.
Sorry, I just can't get it out of my head.
I know. It's been on the radio every time I get in the car all week.
You ought to stay tuned to BBC Three. Then you're safe.
Well, some of us don't care for an exclusive diet of Elizabethan madrigals and operatic arias, Jane. Anyway, has it ever occurred to you that there's something rather fundamental about the hit tunes?
What do you mean?
Well, they come along out of nowhere, and for weeks everybody's humming them, just like Charlie did. The good ones grab hold of you so tight you can't get them out of your head. They go round and round for days and then suddenly vanish.
I know what you mean. Most songs are take it or leave it, but others stick, and I end up humming them in the shower whether I want to or not.
Exactly. Thanks to you, I'm going to be saddled with Hot to Go for even longer. And remember when sea shanties were briefly a thing? Remember what the Wellerman did to us all?
Soon may the Wellerman come to bring us tea and rum.
Well, that's enough of that. Now, what is it about these tunes that have this effect? Some of them are great music, others not so much. They've obviously got something in common.
Go on, we're waiting.
I don't know what the answer is. And what's more, I don't want to. For I know a professor who found out.
It was at this point someone automatically handed Harry a beer so his tail would not be disturbed. It always annoyed us when he had to stop mid-flight for a refill.
Professor Lister, thank you for taking the time for this interview. I know that a lot of our listeners will be very interested in your research.
Of course, of course. I don't know why it is, but most scientists are interested in music. I've known several large labs that have their own amateur symphony orchestras, some of them quite good too. Music, particularly classical music, has a form which is almost mathematical. And then, of course, there's the underlying theory: harmonic relations, wave analysis, frequency distribution, and so on. It's a fascinating study in itself, and one that appeals strongly to the scientific mind. Moreover, it doesn't, as some people might think, preclude a purely aesthetic appreciation of music for its own sake. However, I must confess that my interest in music is purely cerebral. I'm primarily a psychologist, specialising in the study of the brain. So when I said that my interest is cerebral, I suppose I mean it quite literally. I'm not concerned with the sounds themselves, but what happens when they get past the ear and start doing things to the brain.
The brain's activity is electrical, right? There are steady, pulsing rhythms going on all the time. And you're detecting and analysing them through electrodes stuck to the scalp.
I see you've done your research. Yes, it was while I was studying the alpha, beta and other rhythms of the brain that I got interested in music. I was sure there must be some connection between musical and mental rhythms. So I played music at various tempos to my subjects and see what effect it had on their normal brain frequency. As you might expect, it had quite a lot. And these discoveries have led me on to more philosophical fields. I'm sure that a great melody or a hit tune makes its impression on the mind because in some way it fits with the fundamental electrical rhythms going on in the brain. Like a key going into a lock, the two patterns fit and the song is stuck in your head.
In your lecture last year, you said you were going to tackle the problem from two angles, and you started by analysing hundreds of the really famous tunes, looking at their structure.
That's correct. Their morphology, all done automatically in a big harmonic analyzer. At the same time, I've been seeing how the resulting patterns of waves agreed with their natural electrical vibrations of the brain. And this is where we get into rather deep philosophical waters. My belief is that all existing tunes are merely crude approximations of one fundamental melody. Musicians have been groping for it for centuries, but they didn't know what they were doing because they were ignorant of the relation between music and mind. Now that this has been unravelled, it should be possible for me to discover the ultimate perfect melody.
So you're after the ideal melody, and since you've invited me for this tour, can I assume you've managed to find it?
It's taken about a year to complete my analysis and then to start the synthesis. To put it crudely, I built a machine that would automatically construct patterns of sound according to the laws that I've uncovered. I could have done it all on the computer, but I had an old electronic organ and modified it to play the notes from the constructed patterns. Perhaps it's rather childish, but it's a tradition at the university to name your mechanical offspring. So, I present to you Ludwig.
Wow.
Maybe it helps to understand how Ludwig operates if you think of him as a kind of kaleidoscope, but working with sound rather than light. He is, however, a kaleidoscope set to obey certain laws based on the fundamental structure of the human mind. If I can get the adjustments correct, Ludwig will sooner or later arrive at the ultimate melody as he searches through all the possible patterns of music.
And it worked. It played perfect music.
I had one opportunity of hearing Ludwig play, and it was uncanny. The equipment was the usual mess of electronics that you'll find in any lab, all monitors, computer towers, and terrible cable management, just with the novel addition of an old Yamaha keyboard at the center. It was hard to believe that if it worked, it would put every composer in the world out of business. At first, it seemed to me I was listening to the 5-finger exercises of an accurate but completely uninspired pupil. Most of the themes were quite dull. The machine would play one pattern, then change bar after bar until it exhausted all the possibilities before going on to the next. Occasionally, a quite striking phrase would come up, but on the whole I was not very impressed. However, Professor Lister explained that this was an initial trial run, and the algorithms based on her actual data had yet to be engaged. When they were, Ludwig would be far more selective. At the moment he was playing everything that came along. He had no sense of discrimination. But when he had acquired that, then the possibilities were endless. That was the last time I ever saw Lister. I had arranged to meet them in a lab about a week later, when she expected to have made substantial progress. As it happens, I was about an hour late for my appointment, and that was very lucky for me. When I had got there, they had just taken Lister away. Her lab assistant, an old man who'd been with her for years, was sitting distraught amongst the tangled wires of Ludwig. It took me a long time to discover what had happened, and longer still to work out the explanation. There was no doubt of one thing. Ludwig had worked. The assistant had gone off to lunch while Lister was making the final adjustments, and when he came back an hour later, the laboratory was pulsing with one long and very complex melodic phrase. Either the machine had stopped automatically at that point, or Lister had switched it over to repeat. At any rate, she had listened to that same melody several times. When his assistant found her, she seemed to be in a trance. Her eyes were open yet unseeing, her limbs rigid. Even when Ludwig was switched off, it made no difference. Lister was beyond help.
What happened?
I suppose we should have thought of it, but it's easy to be wise after the event. If a human composer, working by trial and error can produce a melody that can dominate your mind for days on end, imagine the effect of the ultimate melody for which Lister was searching. Suppose it existed, and I'm not admitting it does. It would form an endless ring in the pattern of the mind, go round and round forever, obliterating all other thoughts. All the catchy tunes of the past would be random noise compared to it. Once it had keyed into the brain and distorted that cycling waveform of consciousness, that would be the end. And that is what happened to Lister. They've tried shock therapy and everything, but it's no good. The pattern has been set and it can't be broken. She's lost all consciousness of the outer world and has to be fed through a tube. She never moves or reacts to external stimuli, but sometimes, they tell me, she twitches in a peculiar way, as if she's keeping time. I'm afraid there's no hope for her. Yet, I'm not sure if her fate is a horrible one or whether she should be envied. Perhaps, in a sense, she's found the ultimate reality that philosophers like Plato are always talking about. I really don't know. Sometimes I find myself wondering just what that melody was like, almost wishing I'd been able to hear it. Perhaps one day there might be some way of doing so safely. Maybe.
Hang on, there's a loose end here. A hole in your plot. You said Lister's assistant was there before the machine was switched off, but he was perfectly fine.
What is this, some kind of cross-examination? I didn't mention it because it was rather trivial, but it explains why I was never able to get the slightest idea of how that melody sounded. You see, Lister's assistant was an excellent lab technician, but he had never been able to help much with the adjustments to Ludwig. He's one of those people who are completely tone-deaf. To him, the ultimate melody meant no more than a couple of cats on a garden wall.
Nobody asked any more questions. We all, I think, felt the desire to commune with our thoughts. There was a long brooding silence before the White Hart resumed its usual activities. And even then, I noticed it was every bit of 10 minutes before Charlie started whistling Hot to Go again.
You've been listening to Tales from the White Hart. The narrator was Simon Allison. Harry was played by Gareth Merton, Charlie by Chris Whiteford, Jane by Lou Polsom, and Professor Lister by Jenny Dyer. This drama is a fan adaptation of Arthur C. Clarke's short stories, and while the original Tales from the White Hart is out of print, many of the stories within can be found in anthologies of Clarke's work, which I very much recommend you read.